and military invasions and wars in the continents around the world. Just going through that list, it's clear that Gandhi still matters, that the tenets of his philosophy are still relevant. Non-violent means to overcome oppression and disputes, cultural pluralism, religious tolerance, social equality, and gender and caste equality, just to name a few. But tonight, we are going to be taken on another journey into the life of the Mahatma, when our guest speaker delivers the lecture on the many enigmas and strange destinations of Mohandas Gandhi. But first, let me introduce him. I must say that his CV, for those of you that have Googled it, very, very comprehensive. And so, with his permission, I will present a short bio tonight. Vinay Lal is a professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He earned his PhD with distinction from the University of Chicago in 1992 after undergraduate and master's degrees in literature and philosophy from the Johns Hopkins University. He writes widely on Indian history, historiography, public and popular culture in India, the Indian diaspora, colonialism, human rights, and the architecture of nonviolence, Gandhi, and of course the global politics of knowledge systems. His 20 authored or edited books include the 2-volume Oxford Anthology of the Modern Indian City in 2013, Political Hinduism, The Religious Imagination in Public Spheres in 2009, The Future of Knowledge and Culture, a Dictionary for the 21st Century, which he co-edited with Ashish Nandi. This was in 2005. Of Cricket, Guinness and Gandhi, Essays on Indian History and Culture, 2003. The Empire of Knowledge, Culture and Plurality in the Global Economy, 2002. India and Civilizational Futures, Backwaters Collective on Metaphysics and Politics, 2, in 2019. A Passionate Life, Writings by and on Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, I think I got that right, co-edited with England, Ellen Carroll de Boer. Then the Fury of COVID-19, the passions, journeys, and unrequited love of the coronavirus in 2020, and most recently, the edited volume, The Colonial State and Forms of Knowledge, the British in India, in 2022 this year. His scholarly work has been translated into Hindi, Urdu, Kannada, French, German, Spanish, Finnish, Korean, and Persian, and his shorter essays and popular writings have been translated into some 40 languages, including Portuguese, Estonian, Ukrainian, Slovak, Russian, Bosnian, Polish, Albanian, Greek, Indonesian, and Thai. Volume 3 of the Backwaters collection on metaphysics and politics, of which he is a founding member, is due from Oxford in early 2023, next year. And the Artist and Insurgency, the Art of the Freedom Struggle in India, is at the moment in the press with Rowley Books for a release in November next month. The works in progress include a book on the history of colonial India told through stories, a study of internet Hinduism, and a book on the American architecture of nonviolence by James Lawson. A 2-volume collection of his essays on Gandhi will be published by Orient Black Swan in mid-2023. He also has the distinction, he says, of being listed among the 101 most dangerous professors in America in David Horowitz's books, The Professors. And he said it's quite likely the only 15 minutes of fame he will ever have in his life. I doubt that. He blogs for APP, India's largest media network, at vinaylal.wordpress.com and at abplive.in, and maintains an academic YouTube channel at youtube.com, user Dilly Chalo, which has nearly 2.5 million viewers. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that introduction, we are in, I'm sure, for an exhilarating evening with Professor Lau, who very kindly consented to take comments and questions at the end of the lecture. May I please request our attendees around the world on Zoom to please mute your devices during the delivery of the lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Vinay Lal to the podium.
Well, David, thank you very much for that extremely generous and lengthy introduction. My thanks to the Pietermaritzburg Gandhi Foundation for this invitation, and of course to David. And I would also like to thank David and John for their very generous hospitality thus far. The lecture today, as you have been told, is entitled "The Many Enigmas and Strange Destinations of Mahatma Gandhi." And let me begin with this following warning, namely that I'm going to unsettle everything you've believed about Gandhi. And of course, I think the first thing to understand, if one wants to think in the spirit of the Mahatma, is to understand that that's exactly what he was doing. One of his many missions in life was to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. And so I think that, we have these assumptions that Gandhi is a peacemaker. Gandhi is someone who is perennially relevant. I can't tell you how many conferences have been held by the government of India in the course of the last 75 years, trying to establish the, quote, relevance of Gandhi. And of course, I can assure you that each conference that is held by the government of India pronouncing his relevance each conference is intended to bury him further into the graveyard. Because the government of India only uses the name of Gandhi as cultural capital. That is, they know that the name of Gandhi earns them goodwill around the world. But the government of India has never been invested in Gandhi's ideas, not for a moment. I think we should be emphatically clear about that. So, one of the things I'm going to suggest to you is that we need to have a very different way of thinking about Gandhi. And what I'm saying to you is not as a critic of Gandhi, but as someone who absolutely believes that there is no one else in history of the stature of Gandhi in many ways. You can not compare him to a founder of a religion, because he's not the founder of a religion. He's not Jesus. He's not Muhammad. He's not the Buddha. He never intended to found a religion. He never had followers in the manner in which the founders of religion came to have followers. But I can tell you that when he died on 30th January 1948, the book that I have that's just coming out next month is a study of the art that was produced at that time and in the 20 years preceding. And Gandhi was constantly shown in the company of Jesus and the Buddha. And the Indian literary critic Harish Trivedi pointed out that there was no one in history. Harish Trivedi is one of the country's most eminent literary critics, who's widely read, not just in the Gandhi literature, but in Hindi literature, in Urdu literature. And he said that he doubted that there was anyone ever who in his lifetime had received the kind of adoration and veneration that Gandhi did. In his lifetime. Of course, the Buddha has received the veneration and adoration of billions of people over the course of the last 2,000 years, but that's much after his death. So I do believe that Gandhi is someone who is absolutely distinct, but I think we need to find a different way of thinking about him, because surely you will agree, given the spiraling violence in which we have been living for so many decades, and which is getting worse by the moment, surely you will agree that all this talk about the relevance of Gandhi and all of that is just precisely that. That it is just a set of expressions which tell us really nothing about what made Gandhi so distinct, because what he sought to do was to unsettle everything. How one conducts politics. Right? And that is why this afternoon I visited the Pietermaritzburg railway station for the first time in my life. I've been to South Africa twice before, but somehow never made it to the city. And when I went there, I was overtaken by emotion because I had read when I was 16, 17 years old, his autobiography. And that moment when he was thrown off the train in Pietermaritzburg marks the moment which is the originary moment when globally we had to now start thinking about race for the first time, globally, and about the nature of injustice and the nature of racism, right? And there is a plaque at the railway station, and it's a beautiful plaque, and I'm not speaking about the plaques that, in honor of the Prime Minister and all of that. It's a quotation from Jan Smuts. So when Mohandas Gandhi left South Africa for the last time in July 1914, General Smuts, and for those of you who are aware of the history, you know that there is what's called the Smuts-Gandhi Agreement of 1913. So General Smuts wrote a letter to another colleague and a friend of his, where he says, "The saint has finally left our shores. I hope forever." I hope forever, because of course there is this, it's beautiful because what it's expressing is this whimsical note, this ironical note. The saint has finally left our shores. Surely you don't want the saint to leave your shores, but of course he's left the shores. Smuts had found an opponent who was not simply worthy of him, but an opponent whom he knew he would never ever see again in history. Which is why, years later, he returned the sandals that Gandhi had made in person for General Smuts. Years later, he returned these sandals to Gandhi. Gandhi was now a Mahatma. He wasn't a Mahatma when he left in 1915. I know that Mandela said that we returned a Mahatma to you. Yes, it was a Mahatma in the making. But when he returned to India, years later, he had become a worldwide figure, and Smuts returned the pair of sandals that Gandhi had made with his own hands and said, "I have never met an opponent like you, and I'm not worthy of these sandals that you made for me." Right? So the question before us today is, just how does one take the measure of a man, known the world over as Mahatma Gandhi? Many people have attempted to do so. So much has been written on him. There are 1,000 biographies in English alone. Some of them are 5-6 volumes in length. And I'm not even including purely scholarly works, what are called monographs in the scholarly world, where you look at this or that particular aspect of Gandhi's thought or life. And then one has no idea how many biographies there are in all other languages put together. So one would think that one has really exhausted the subject. But Gandhi is like the Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. They're never exhausted. Right? They're inexhaustible. And what happens in those epics? The heroes are banished. Ram is banished. For those of you who know the Ramayana, what happens in the Mahabharata? The Pandavas are sent into exile. And Gandhi was banished from India right after independence. I mean, is it a coincidence that he was assassinated 6 months after the independence of India? Because there is no question that many thought the man had served his purpose. What do we want to do with this half-naked fakir in his late 70s? He's kind of useless. Because if we're going to build into a strong muscular state, we cannot have a man who keeps on doing womanly things, who's effeminate. I mean, for Christ's sake, to use that expression, he goes on a fast. He spins, he weaves, he listens to the inner voice. One can't run a state on the advice of a person like Mohandas Gandhi. The Indian leadership, the Indian middle class had had enough of him. So they essentially banished him, but he still had the veneration of tens of millions. And the work of banishing him continues. Excise him from the memory of India completely. One of the ways in which you excise the memory of Gandhi is you make sure that on every October 2nd, you garland every statue of his. The Prime Minister, the Chief Ministers, every minister will go and garland the statues, and the moment they've garlanded the statue, they've forgotten it. You can be entirely sure of that. And Robert Musil, who's a great German author, most of you may not have heard of him, 20th century German philosopher, essayist, he said the most, and I quote him, the most remarkable thing about monuments is that one does not notice them. There is nothing in this world as invisible as a monument. So while in my own private way I might be pleased to see the statues of Gandhi, including the one in Pietermaritzburg, I must have seen probably 500, 1,000 statues of Gandhi around the world easily by now. You know. And I can assure you that the more statues we have of Gandhi, the more likely we are to forget it. There is no question in my mind that that is invariably the outcome, right? So my purpose today is not going to attempt to make Gandhi seem relevant to you. I leave that to the government institutions and the government functionaries. My purpose is very different. What I propose to do is to offer you something of a preliminary, intellectual, ethical framework for the study of Gandhi and the histories of nonviolence. I may be appearing to speak at times in riddles, but I will suggest to you that Gandhi cannot be approached merely as someone who is relevant, someone who is a peacemaker, and someone who is there to remind us all of our better selves. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote, "They make war and they call it peace." They make war and they call it peace. This is an exact quotation from his histories. Because Tacitus understood one thing back then, 2,000 years ago, that peace is not what we should be striving for. And Gandhi seldom actually wrote about peace. Seldom. He wrote about ahimsa and satya, not peace. Because after all the warmongers we have in the world, they're all allegedly fighting wars in order to create peace. So Gandhi should be viewed as a necessary provocation, a disruptor of the consensus, someone who is there to unsettle us. And this is why I call my talk The Many Enigmas and Strange Destinations. Where was Gandhi headed for? What was the journey that he took? How was he thrown off that journey repeatedly by temptations? I use that metaphor deliberately because I'm in Pietermaritzburg. He was thrown off while he was undertaking his first journey in South Africa. And Gandhi journeyed throughout life. And we all get thrown off. Some of us recover our feet. He did so in a very spectacular way. Let me begin also with this anomaly. We are gathered here today, of course, because it is his birth anniversary. Technically, of course, 2 days ago. Now, October 2nd is not unimportant. Of course, it's not unimportant. And the UN General Assembly declared it the International Day of Nonviolence. But for someone such as myself, it is the 30th of January that is the more important day, or what we may provisionally call the Gandhi calendar. So the Gandhi calendar is all those critically important days. On 30th January, what happened? Many of you will know, but some of you may not recall. On 30th January 1948, some minutes after 5 o'clock in the evening, Gandhi was shot dead while he was walking to his evening prayer meeting at Birla House in New Delhi by Nathuram Godse, a Chitpavan Brahmin from Pune, who harbored many a grudge against Gandhi and who would go on to elaborate his views at some length in a statement which was subsequently proscribed by the government of India. So what Godse wrote in his own defense, the government of India immediately banned it. You could not find that statement for 20 years. The government of India has always been a timid government. They banned what his assassin wrote. Because his assassin, though being a vile man, you had to be vile to assassinate the Mahatma. Nevertheless, understood some things about the Mahatma which the government was loath to admit. Now, I will not enter into a discussion of Godse's statement at this juncture. I'm willing to take questions on that or on anything else that I've said today. But the Shahidat or martyrdom of Gandhi is for many such as myself the more critical date. The late Ramchandra Gandhi, whose brother Gopal Krishna Gandhi served as a High Commissioner of India to this country, and the late Ramu Gandhi was a friend of mine, one of Mohandas's grandsons, and an eminent thinker and philosopher in his own right, put the matter thus in his characteristically inimitable fashion. This is how he described the assassination. It's one of the most extraordinary, beautiful descriptions. Gandhi stopped 3 bullets on their deathly trajectory of hate. End quote. Difficult as is the art of living, Gandhi knew that the art of dying is even more difficult. Now we are at a very peculiar juncture in modern India. India was roiled by protests, consumed by protests. I don't know how closely you follow events in India, but in late 2019, they had one of the most extraordinary movements of nonviolent resistance in India that they've had since the death of Gandhi. This is called the Shaheen Bagh movement. This was a movement undertaken by largely illiterate, certainly semi-literate Muslim women in one of North India's neighborhoods. I documented this movement. I was there at that time, not for the whole duration, paid 2 visits to it. And then, of course, some of you may be aware they had what's called the farmers' movement. Right? So India's had a great deal of unrest. And it's had this unrest, and the government has attempted to meet this unrest with absolute brutal force, wherever it has been able to do so. The Shaheen Bagh movement, they were not able to suppress at all. But luckily for them, COVID struck. Because when COVID struck, the Prime Minister of India on March 24th at 8 p.m. issued a lockdown notice, a complete, utter lockdown, which was going to take effect in 4 hours at midnight. An absolute fiasco. But again, that's a different story. But what happened? That lockdown was accompanied by an emergency ordinance which gave the police the power to remove anyone found on the street after the lockdown had started. And so all the Shaheen Bagh protesters were immediately removed. And the entire area, 1 kilometer of murals that they had done, all of which I had documented, within 3 hours, all of them had been whitewashed. They sent an army of painters and washed it. So there's a lockdown, but there's no lockdown for these government employees who have been tasked with the job of removing all these murals. Right? So this is how the government works in India, the land that claims to be the land of Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi has been very much present in these demonstrations of resistance to state authoritarianism, even if the demonstrators have not always understood what it meant to offer satyagraha, even if the very idea of satyagraha is sometimes not present to them. Although when they invoked Hindu-Muslim unity, as all the protesters did, they were of course invoking the spirit of Gandhi. Because there were very few causes that were as dear to Gandhi as Hindu-Muslim unity, right? So, I'm setting it up for you to understand some of the dilemmas. This is what I mean by the enigmas, right? That this very government, this very state, the middle class in India, this is not just a problem of the government and the state, it's the middle class in India. This middle class in India has attempted to reduce Gandhi, and I'm going to use his own language, to zero. Because remember what Gandhi said on a number of occasions, my endeavor in life is to reduce myself to zero. What does that mean? You know, the idea of zero comes from India. As a mathematical concept, it comes from India. But zero, the word is shunya. Shunya means emptiness. But emptiness is never emptiness, because you have to empty yourself in order to remove your ego and make room for God. In mystical writings all over the world, this is an idea that has been widely prevalent. The idea of shunyata, zero. And this is what Gandhi attempted to do. He attempted to reduce himself to zeros, right? Now, I could keep on going on in this way. Let me attempt to discuss certain aspects of Gandhi's thinking. It is also necessary to say, before I venture into that we now face a risk which we never faced before. Which we've never faced before. And that is the risk of social media. Right? The kind of material that circulates on social media on Gandhi, scurrilous, violent attacks on Gandhi, I don't know how many of you are aware of them. Because in some ways, there is a kind of an innocence in the diaspora. In India, I can assure you, the attacks on Gandhi come from all quarters, from everywhere that you can think about. And it is very clear that there is no understanding of what Gandhi stood for. So, for example, about a year ago, my son, who's now 22, came to me and said, "Dad, I want to show you some social media posts, and I want you to tell me whether the allegations there are true or not." The social media post said that Gandhi was a friend of Hitler. Now I knew, I didn't even have to see it to where that came from. I knew immediately. And I knew why there was no work of interpretation going on. This showed me the sheer emptiness of the modern discourse, and I'll explain to you and you'll understand what I mean. There were two occasions when Gandhi addressed a letter to Adolf Hitler. Both of these letters begin with the salutation, "Dear friend." Now, if you've ever written a letter, or if you've ever been a student of literature over the course of literature of the last 400 years, and if you still believe in writing letters, you know that you address, whenever you write to someone, what do you do? "Dear so-and-so, dear Mr. President, dear Anne, dear Singh." Even if that person is your opponent, even if you disregard that person, that's simply a protocol of writing. Now, incidentally, neither of these two letters was ever delivered to Hitler. Neither of the letters was delivered because both of the letters were written in wartime, and every letter that was sent by Gandhi went through the hands of the censor. Neither letter was ever delivered to Adolf Hitler. And what he wrote to Adolf Hitler was that, "I want to suggest to you that your ways are not right. There's something wicked in what you are seeking to do, and I urge you to follow the path of nonviolence." Now, you might say to yourself, well, wasn't Gandhi naive? Let's take that allegation aside for a moment. But surely no one with half a mind could think that because Gandhi wrote a letter to Hitler, two letters addressed with the salutation, "Dear friend," that Hitler was Gandhi's friend. See, there is no awareness here. Now let me make the argument more complex. There is no awareness here in those people who are saying that of Gandhi's view that there is what we in philosophy call an ontological argument, which I'll explain to you in a moment, for nonviolence. That ontological argument for nonviolence is that there is not a single person in the world who is without a spark of divinity. The most evil person may have some iota of good in them. And the best people in the world will have an iota of evil in them. Because Gandhi was firmly of the view that people are not monstrous. Their acts may be monstrous. Hitler's acts were monstrous. His acts were a monstrosity. But Hitler was perfectly capable of having affection for his dogs. Hitler was also, by the way, a vegetarian. For those who say that being a vegetarian is the highest thing in the world, well, Gandhi and Hitler obviously shared something. They were both vegetarians. Now you see what I'm saying? That the person who reads these letters and then writes on social media, and by the way, this is not one post. I can tell you, I encounter this every day. I mean, there are millions of people out there just putting this. Gandhi was a pedophile, he was a racist, he was an adulterer, he was a fascist, he was friends with Hitler. It just goes on and on and on. And you can have any number of conferences about the relevance of Gandhi. What are you going to do about all of this? Think of it, right? Gandhi's view was, when he wrote to Hitler, that it is impossible to adopt the view that truth is always entirely on your side and there isn't a shred of truth in the other position. Because if you believe in that, then it's a kind of epistemological violence. Right? So in the midst of these criticisms, how do we make room for a certain kind of play with the ideas and life of Gandhi? I would like to put before you a vision of Gandhi as a player of infinite games. I begin my reflections on this matter with the African-American activist Bayard Rustin. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with him. He's widely recognized as a key player in the civil rights movement and as a master organizer who worked to make possible the famous March on Washington in 1963. This is the march where you may have seen photographs, some of you, where Martin Luther King addressed 250,000 people in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Memorial and said, "I have a dream, I have a dream." Right? That's his speech. Who organized that march? That was Bayard Rustin. Rustin was a lifelong student of the life and work of Gandhi, who had a large hand in shaping King's understanding of satyagraha and bringing nearly the entire arsenal of Gandhian ideas of mass nonviolent resistance to the fore in the struggle for civil and political rights. His most prominent biographer, John D'Amelio, says unhesitatingly that more than anyone else, Rustin brought the message and methods of Gandhi to the United States. And here again, this is a different subject, which I'm not going to develop here, but there is a tendency to associate the entire civil rights movement with one figure. That's Martin Luther King. But it was a whole galaxy of figures, a whole galaxy of really remarkable figures. Just as in this country, there is a tendency to eventually reduce everything to Mandela. But there was Ahmed Khatrada, there was Mac Maraj, Billy Nair, Oliver Tambo, Fatima Mir. They were all part of the movement. They were critically important, all of them, in the movement, right? Rustin's eyes were turned upon the anti-colonial struggle in India, and he was firmly of the view that no situation in America has created so much interest among Negroes as the Gandhian proposal for India's freedom. See, there were all these black thinkers, and I deliberately bring this example here because we're living in a country that is predominantly black, and where we had the black people engaging in a struggle to free themselves of the oppressiveness of European rule. Right? And in the United States, black people from 1920 onwards began to look to India, to what Gandhi was doing there, to say, can we learn something from what he's doing there? Right? Now, King was but a schoolboy, but Rustin had already established a reputation as a one-man nonviolent army working on behalf of an organization called FORE, that's the Fellowship of Reconciliation, an international religious organization that advocated radical pacifism and that in the US sought a distinctive and revolutionary approach to the race problem. Rustin sought to desegregate lunch counters in the Deep South. Now, when I say desegregate, I'm going to explain things because not all of you again may be aware, but you know, they had these lunch counters in the Deep South in places like Mississippi, Tennessee, and so if you went to a Woolworths, I don't know if they have Woolworths here, they may. Okay, so if you went to a Woolworths, there would be a lunch counter in the 1950s, and it would say, for white people only, and for colored people only. Of course, you know, apartheid. That's apartheid, right? Well, they had them. So the idea was you try to desegregate them. Rustin was very important in the attempt to desegregate them. So black people would go and sit in the section where it said for whites only. And then the white people would start beating them, spitting them, throwing ketchup, mustard on them, right? Rustin was one of the pioneers of this. So Rustin sought to desegregate lunch counters in the Deep South, and on a bus ride from Louisville to Nashville in 1942 moved to the section which was reserved by both law and custom for whites. When he refused to vacate his seat, the police were summoned and he was verbally abused and pummeled with blows. Rustin also assumed an avuncular role as chief advisor to another organization known as CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, an organization founded in 1942 with the explicit intention of bringing Gandhi's ideas to the struggle against racism. Now, Rustin embraced an outlook that most of Gandhi's own associates in the Congress Party rejected, viewing nonviolence not just as a policy but as a way of life, a way of being in the world. Let me pause here for a moment to elaborate on this idea. See, when we think of Gandhi and nonviolence, we think of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi brought forward a method known as satyagraha, right? Forced truth. Gandhi never reduced nonviolence to nonviolent resistance. Nonviolence is a way of being in the world. And in the English language, there is a problem with the word nonviolence. There is a problem for the reason that nonviolence is what? The absence of violence. See, you need violence to define nonviolence. If someone said, what is violence? Usually the answer would not be the absence of nonviolence. It wouldn't be. Because in the English language, violence takes precedence over nonviolence. You add the negation. It's a fundamental problem, which is one reason why, if you think there, as I said, 1,000 books on Gandhi, I can tell you there are 100,000 books on violence. Anthropologists are absolutely fascinated by violence. Very few things have been studied as much as violence in human history. Right? So we have to reflect on the problematic that Gandhi had to work with, because the task before him was Herculean. How to bring the idea of ahimsa, non-violence, before the world. It is a radical idea, never before attempted in history. Now that doesn't mean that you cannot find ideas of non-violence in other writings. But when Henry David Thoreau wrote his essay on the duty of civil disobedience, which Gandhi read, Thoreau was not thinking of non-violence as a way of being in the world, nor was he thinking of non-violence as a form of mass resistance. I don't think we are sufficiently appreciative of the enormous task required to bring an idea that was doomed at birth before the world, which is what Mohandas attempted to do. And now a black man in America, Bayard Rustin, long before King, at least 2 decades before King, is attempting to think about that. Rustin had to be unfortunately placed in the background later on for a number of reasons. For one thing, he was a communist, and the American civil rights movement did not want among its leaders a person who was a communist, because that would discredit the whole movement. He was also a homosexual. He was a homosexual, he was a communist, he was black, he was a Quaker. I mean, talk about being doubly disadvantaged, triply, quadruply, I don't know. I mean, he was disadvantaged in every possible sense of the term, right? And here's this black man who is now attempting to contest something called violence, about which the American rap artist H. Rap Brown once rightly said, violence is as American as cherry pie. You know? As American as cherry pie. So you see, there in India, in South Africa, it was a Herculean struggle. Right? Now, what is indubitably true is that Rustin, and this was true of all the people who worked at the American Civil Rights Movement, had a masterful understanding of Gandhi and appeared to have imbibed his spirit, at least in his capacity as a non-violent political activist. Now, the skeptic might be inclined to say that Rustin did what many others did, namely instrumentalize nonviolence as an effective way of organizing and instigating American resistance to racism, and remain indifferent to other aspects of Gandhi's idea of nonviolence. So I repeat once again that Gandhi, when he's speaking of ahimsa, he's not just speaking of resistance, nonviolent resistance. What does it mean to live a nonviolent life? Think of it that way. After all, you're not resisting every single moment of your life. Right? So how does one live a life of non-violence? Right? And I'm trying to suggest that here, even the greatest civil rights leaders in countries such as the United States fell dramatically short. I think that was the case here too. I think here the failing was greater, partly because, and I know this is a controversial matter, I work on this history as well, that here Nelson Mandela came rather too quickly to the thinking that nonviolence was inadequate. And so therefore he created the MK, the Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing, where, and he says in his autobiographies that he got the approval of Albert Luthuli, who was a president of the ANC and who was undoubtedly the person most dedicated to the ideas of Gandhi in this country. But Luthuli never gave his consent. You could say that he didn't disagree because he was silenced. So now we have to interpret what Luthuli's silence may have meant. Right? But it is very clear that there was a departure from the idea of nonviolence in South Africa relatively early, I would say. And I know that the vast majority of historians, particularly black historians who work on this question, will probably take a different view. But let us look at it in a different way. That gives us another segue into Gandhi. And here we encounter yet another set of enigmas now. Which is that one reason why Gandhi was able to persist as long as he did was not because the English were a comparatively gentler oppressor. One of the arguments that's often made about Gandhi, even by those who admire him, is they say, well, Gandhi was fortunate in that his opponent was the English, not Stalin, not Hitler. Because had it been Hitler, he would have been blown apart. Hitler would never have tolerated Gandhi for a moment. He would have put him away. He would have crushed him, eliminated him, killed him. He would have killed all his associates, and of course everyone points to what the Nazi state was like. Well, I can tell you that you do not begin nonviolent resistance in 1939. Nonviolence is a process. After all, the writing was on the wall for long before Hitler came to power. And a movement of nonviolent resistance would have started back in the 1920s, not in 1940. You have to think about what Gandhi would have done, because Gandhi was never persuaded by this view that, oh, the English are gentlemanly, and you have to really know what the English did in India. Because there is no question in my mind that they actually caused genocide over a long period of time in India, as they did in many other parts of the world. One of the reasons why Gandhi was able to persist with nonviolence is because he had the uncanny ability, partly generated by his own thinking, of gathering around him the most unlikely followers and disciples. Right? I mean, what a motley crowd of people came to work with him. Let me give you one illustration. Many of you have, if you've seen Attenborough's film on Gandhi, I'm sure some of you here have, but I don't know how much you know about this English woman called Madeline Slade, who became one of Gandhi's disciples. In fact, to the extent that she basically served Gandhi everything. It is even said that Kasturba felt jealousy at one point because Miraban was closer to the Mahatma than Kasturba was. Right? Well, who was Miraban? How did she become a disciple of Gandhi? I mean, the most unlikely person in the world. And I'll tell you that story because now you'll understand what I mean. When I said that, how did this man gather so many people from so many walks of life to abandon everything, abandon their whole life and just come running to him and say, we're going to sit at your feet. You know, the old-time sociologists used to say, that's called charisma. That's bogus. Charisma doesn't tell us anything. Well, what does charisma mean now? So what happened in the case of Madeline Slade? Madeline Slade, who became Miraban, was the daughter of an English admiral of the fleet. I mean, he was one of the most highly ranking naval officials in the United Kingdom. She came from a very aristocratic family. Now, she was in love with the music of Beethoven. So one day, she went to see a man called Romain Rolland, who was a very famous writer. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And Romain Rolland had written a biography of Beethoven. So she goes to Switzerland, gets an audience with him, and says, I've come to learn at your feet about the great master Beethoven. And so Romain Rolland very politely talks to her, and then finds out that she's interested in philosophy and all of that. And Romain Rolland says to her, this is 1921, he says to her, you know, Beethoven died 150 years ago. But there is a man living amongst us who I think will satisfy your needs, who is as great as Beethoven. He creates music in a very different way. Don't expect Mohandas to sing, by the way. Okay. And she says, who is this man? And he says, his name is Mohandas Gandhi. And she says, I've never heard of him. Now, he had also written a biography of Gandhi, one of the first biographies in a European language. The biography is called The Man Who Became One with the Infinite. And so he says, if you want to worship a God, worship a living God. Don't go to a dead God. Worship a living God. So what does she do? She goes back home and she writes a letter to Mohandas Gandhi. She, of course, reads a biography and says, Dear Bapuji, he was already being described as Bapu by someone. I am so-and-so, and I'd like to come and I'm the daughter of an English admiral, and I would like to come and devote the rest of my life to you. And he writes back to her. See, he never discouraged anyone. Today, the tendency would say, you know, she's a crank. Why even bother replying to the letter? No. He replied to every single letter he received. Every single letter he received in his life, he replied to it. So he writes to her, I mean, it's extraordinary. He writes to her saying, Dear Miss Slade, received your letter, etc. I greatly appreciate your interest in my life and work. And I do not want to discourage you from coming, but I must make you aware of the fact, given what you have told me about yourself, that life and conditions in India are very difficult, and they're even more difficult in my ashram because you're going to be sleeping on a wooden floor. The food is all vegetarian. You'll have to clean your own toilet. And I suggest that you spend 1 year preparing yourself for this ordeal before you come to me. She follows his advice. As she gets the letter, she summons the servants and says, remove all the bedding from my room. Remove all the mattress. The servants call Madeleine's mother and say, your daughter seems to have gone crazy. Do you want to have her admitted to a mental institution? She's saying, remove all the furniture and only cook plain meals for me. No meat, no salt, no onion, no garlic. Right? And the parents think their daughter has gone absolutely nuts, to use a colloquialism. Right? But she does precisely that. And then she arrives in India a year later. And the description in her autobiography is priceless. I mean, it's just priceless how she describes what happened. So she arrives at the railway station, and Mohandas Gandhi is always a railway station in Gandhi's life. But we'll leave that aside for a moment. That's another book, another lecture. Arrives at the railway station, and he has sent Sardar Patel. For those of you who know the history of India, you know how important he was. A very, very close associate of Gandhi. He wept when the Mahatma was shot dead. Wept like a child. He sends Patel, and then he brings him to the ashram, and she's sent to a room where she's freshens up, and then she describes in her autobiography the Spirit's pilgrimage. She was ushered into the Mahatma's presence, and then she says, all I saw was a halo of light. All I saw was a halo of light. And then the Mahatma's hand was placed on my hand, and he said, blessings be upon you, you shall be upheld. So that is a disciple. Then there's an economist, a Tamilian Brahmin. Then there's an Anglican clergyman. There's a Quaker. The Sardar himself, known as the Iron Man. Right? I mean, if I start giving you the biographies of all the people who were drawn to him, you'd say, how did this man draw such a motley crowd of people to himself? Now that's very important. This is not simply a matter of anecdotes. Why? Because I want to make an argument here which should suggest just how radical and how ethical Gandhi was. See, Gandhi came to the awareness that freedom is indivisible. You cannot be free if the group here is unfree. Freedom is indivisible. Now, what this means is the following. It means that it is not just the Indians and the Africans here who have to be liberated. The British have to be liberated from their own worst tendencies. Because before you go colonize anyone else, you have to colonize yourself. You have to literally colonize yourself. You have to excise some part of yourself, some part of your moral self. But you also have to colonize yourself in other ways. And the English colonized the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, their working class, their women. They experimented on all of these people living with them for hundreds of years before they went out and brutalized Indians and brutalized Africans. You have to brutalize yourself. And so Gandhi said, the anti-colonial struggle will not just free us from them, it will actually free them. It is critically important to understand that. And that is one reason all these people came to Gandhi. Because they knew that Gandhi was saying something to them that nobody in England or Europe was saying to them. See? He always thought in a radically different way. But what do the sociologists do? They say, oh, he had charisma. That idea of charisma has run its course. Right? But he also drew all these people to himself for many other reasons. For example, he never demanded of anyone something that he did not first demand of himself. And here again I'll tell you a story. So I'll constantly weave in a story into the theory. And what's the story? The story is he's at his ashram at Vardha, Sevagram, and he used to confer darshan. The Hindus here among you will understand the idea of darshan because it's a cardinal idea in Hindu thought. So darshan is, to simplify it here, that for example, you're a devotee, you go to a pilgrimage place because you want darshan, you want to be able to see the image of that deity, right? It's actually two ways. The deity needs to see you. By the way, if God didn't have his devotees, what would God do? Right? God needs his devotees too. It's not just devotees who need God. Let's not forget that. Darshan is two ways. Right? So Gandhi would be sitting there, he would be conferring darshan, that is, and people would come to him for advice. And there was always a long line of people. So there's this old woman, a grandmother, with her 5-6-year-old boy. And they've been standing patiently in line to see the Mahatma. And finally their turn comes after 1 hour. And the grandmother says to Gandhi, my little grandson, he eats too many sweets. And his teeth are already decaying. He's only 5 years old. I'm 60, my teeth are decaying, but he's only 5. And he doesn't listen to me. I'm hoping he'll listen to you because you are, after all, the Mahatma. And so Gandhi says to her, come back to me after a month. And she's really puzzled, but after all, the oracle has spoken. When the oracle has spoken, you don't dispute it. So she goes back. A month later, she comes back, just as he'd said. Come back to me after a month. Right? And again, they're standing in line. Finally, their turn comes, and she reminds him, and he says, no, I remember you very well. And then he says to the little boy, no, you shouldn't eat so many sweets. And then he opens his, look at me, all his teeth were false. Right? Look at me. You're going to become like me, but when you're this young, if you don't stop eating sweets, they're bad for you. And all of that. And the boy nods and said, how Indians not. I said, Bapuji, I agree. I will do what you say, Bapuji. And the grandmother says to Bapuji, but Bapuji, you could have said the same thing to him a month ago. Why did you have us come back? After a month, he says, the problem is, a month ago, I was eating too many sweets. So the last 1 month, I have stopped eating sweets. I had to first do that before I could tell him to stop eating sweets. Who else would think that way? This is not the Gandhi that you've been told about, is it? No. Not at all. This is the Gandhi you have to begin to understand, to see what made Mohandas the Mahatma. Because the Mahatma, Ananda Kumara Swami, a great Indian thinker and philosopher, Sri Lankan/Indian, reminds us is not just a great soul. A Mahatma is a man who has achieved self-realization. He's among the enlightened ones in that particular sense, right? So, If I were to continue in this vein, I could pick any element from any domain and suggest what makes Gandhi so very different. Let me look at a couple more instances of what I call the playfulness of Gandhi. See, Gandhi was eminently playful. He was what I have called, I use the ideas of a philosopher of religion who just died unfortunately a few years ago. I had the great pleasure of knowing him, one of the greatest thinkers of our times, but very little recognized, a man called James Carse, who wrote a book called Finite and Infinite Games. And he said we are all players of finite games. It is only a few people here and there who are players of infinite games. Because players of infinite games play to win. They play to achieve. Players of infinite games play to play, not to achieve. The player of infinite games, as a student of thought, doesn't worry about degrees, about accolades. I have many accolades, it doesn't matter if I didn't have any. And the accolades never stop. There are always hierarchies. Someone went to some 5th grade college, the other one went to 4th grade, the next one went to a 3rd grade. Within the 3rd grade, you're a lecturer, then you're a senior lecturer, then you're assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, distinguished professor, honorary research professor. You see, they keep on dangling these accolades. And the more you get, the more pompous you become. All of these people are players of finite games. Finite games. The real student of knowledge is just there. The real player of the game is just there to play. Gandhi was a player of infinite games. And that is why his reading of religion was unlike anything ever seen in history. Let me do another question of religion. Because I come from the vantage point of someone who is a non-believer. I'm a non-believer. My mother doesn't like that, but that's how it is. You know? I've always been a non-believer. And Gandhi said, you can be a Hindu and not believe in God. Now you try to solve that riddle, if you can. All right? Gandhi also was viewed by every Christian missionary who met him said, Gandhi poses a real problem for us. What was the problem? How can you convert a man who is a much better Christian than anyone they have ever met who declared himself a Christian? All the Christian missionaries said, Gandhi is a much better Christian, even though he doesn't call himself a Christian, than all the Christians we know. So how do you convert him? And Gandhi was not an advocate of conversion at all. He was not an advocate of conversion because he never believed in the hierarchy of religions. The person who converts believes in the hierarchy of religions. Believes that the religion you're converting to gives you something that your religion cannot. Gandhi's view was every religion is adequate. Every religion has enough within it for anyone. There's no reason for you to convert. If you convert, it's only because you don't understand your religion sufficiently enough. He's not saying that the other religion is insufficient, because he's not promoting conversion from that religion to your religion. No. So if you're a Hindu, what should you do? You should pray that you'll become a better Hindu. And you should pray that the Muslim will become a better Muslim. And that the Christian will become a better Christian. You shouldn't pray that the person should convert to your religion. If you do, you've lost the meaning of prayer. In fact, every time you pray and you ask for something, you have ridiculed the prayer. He's quite firm about that. But he did not oppose conversion. He couldn't oppose conversion, because if someone came to him and said, I want to convert, Gandhi might say, well, I don't encourage it, but I'm not going to oppose it, because that is his awareness that we are living in the modern world where there is something called freedom of religious expression. We are living in countries which have constitutions. We are not living in the 5th century BC. If you have a modern constitution, then how do you work within that ambit and yet create an ethical space? Right? This is what Gandhi is going to attempt to do. And this is why, once again, we run into that enigma. The enigma is that Gandhi is a person who, if he believes in the freedom of religious speech and expression as he does, then you would say that he's for conversion. No, for reasons that I have described to you. In fact, I will go so far as to say that Gandhi was a staunch advocate of secularism. He was adamant that independent India will be a secular state. But secular, this is where you have to really delve into his thinking and reflect on it. That only the religious person can be secular. Why is that the case? Because a secular person does not have an understanding of religion. See, in the academy, and I'm speaking here particularly of the academy in the United States, but also European countries and Western Europe, most academics are secular. Right? I mean, at universities such as mine, University of California, you don't want to go around in your department declaring yourself an evangelical Christian or this or that. No, that's not very tasteful, if I may put it this way. Okay? Or declaring yourself a devout Muslim. Most people, most academics are secular, but their secularism, Gandhi would have said, is shallow. Because their secularism makes them often incapable of understanding the worldview of the believer. And the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of people in the world are religious believers. So how do we enter into their domain? Now, Gandhi's submission was that the only way you can be secular is by being religious. What do I mean by that? It is Gandhi's Hinduism. It is his being a devout Hindu that made him a secular person. That is, a believer in the person, believer in the idea that the state should have nothing to do with religion. And certainly that the state cannot promote one religion over any other religion. It is Maulana Azad. I don't know if there's anyone in this room, or barring maybe a few people who are more familiar with Maulana Azad. Maulana Azad was a devout Muslim, but he was a secular believer in secular India. Why did he not leave India in 1947 when the Muslims went over to Pakistan? He didn't. It is Maulana Azad's belief as a Muslim that made him a secularist. It is Gandhi's devout Hinduism that made him a secularist. But if we believe that religion and secularism are the opposite of each other, we will never be able to come to that understanding. Right? So, all of this is what I mean. But rather than continuing on with my thoughts on this, what I would like to do is to just read maybe the concluding paragraph or two of this paper. I have been speaking more, not to the text as such. I have a text, but the text is always pro forma, it's less interesting in many ways, right? And to allow you the opportunity to pose questions. So let me read out just the last 2 paragraphs of this set of reflections. And I continue, in this case, with my discussion of religion and move to the end. Gandhi often spoke of something called the litmus test of conscience. So you're a religious believer, and then you encounter a text in your scripture, which is clearly repulsive. I believe, by the way, that every scripture has some passages that are unacceptable. I mean, if you're a Christian, there are portions of the Bible which are completely unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. And I don't mean just in the Old Testament, in Leviticus or Deuteronomy, right? But even in portions of the New Testament, because Paul was undoubtedly someone who, for example, there are portions of the Bible where it says clearly that women shall live in subjection to men. Wives shall always live in subjection to husbands. Right? Now there is a text that Gandhi adored. It's a Ramcharitmanas. The Ramcharitmanas is Tulsidas' epic, first told by Valmiki, the Ramayana. In some other, one of the subjects of study I have is the Indian diaspora worldwide. So that's one of the things that brings me to South Africa. This is my 3rd visit. And I've been to Fiji, I've been to Malaysia, to Guyana, to Suriname, wherever there are Indian populations, very often under conditions of indenture, as happened in South Africa. Of course, I know that not all the Indians who came here came under indenture, but the majority of them did. And then, of course, there were merchants, and teachers and so on, the so-called passenger Indians. Now in Fiji, among the Indians, because in Fiji, the indentured Indians largely came from the Bhojpuri-speaking belt in North India. And for them, the Ramcharitmanas is a venerable text, as it was for Gandhi. So in Fiji, I didn't have to explain, anything about the Manas to the Indians. They all knew it. In fact, large parts of Fiji are just called Manas country, in short, from the Ramcharitmanas. Yeah? So there's a passage in the Ramcharitmanas. That passage is Dhol, Ganvar, Shudra, Pashu, Nari. Okay? Dhol is drums, Ganvar is illiterate, Shudra is a Shudra, that is low caste person, Pashu, animal, Nari, woman. Drums, the illiterate, the Shudras, animals, and women. What do you suppose might be common to all 5? Can anyone guess? What does Tulsidas say? Drums. What do you do with drums? You beat them. That is what's common to all 5. Tulsidas says, all 5 are worthy of being beaten. This is a passage from the Ramcharitmanas. It's a holy text. Dhol, Ganvar, Shudra, Pashu, Nari, Shakal, Tarana or Tadana, ke Adhikari deserving. All worthy of being beaten. Now, he found this passage highly objectionable. And he said, throw it out. Throw it out. Because it does not pass the litmus test of conscience. If your conscience tells you this passage is objectionable, reject it. Doesn't matter if someone tells you it is written by the hand of God. Doesn't matter. Reject it. That is a litmus test of conscience. Right? If one's conscience rebels against such misogyny, then the offensive passage has to be discarded. Gandhi was similarly unimpressed by arguments about the infallibility of the Quran. You speak to Muslims and speak about the infallibility of the Quran. He never accepted that. And he entered into debates with Maulvis over that particular question. Because he said there are passages in the Quran and in the Hadiths which are objectionable. They do not pass the litmus test of conscience. Right? Now, in some respects, you might say this view is not altogether distinct. A modern liberal thinker might say the same thing. Right? That his view here might be something common with the enlightened liberal. But, as I've already suggested to you, his views cannot be viewed as identical to that of liberals for the reasons that I have described, for the position that he takes on the question of religion and secularism. Right? Because a liberal is completely devoted to the task of secularism. Right? So while Gandhi unquestionably shared with avowed secularists such as Nehru, who had no appetite for public displays of religiosity. So Nehru was a hardcore secularist in the modern liberal sense. That he had no appetite for religion at all, right? Or Jinnah. And you know who Jinnah is, of course, he's the father of Pakistan, who claimed to be a Muslim, was the most un-Muslim person you could possibly think of. I mean, he ate pork, he drank wine. That's a fact. He completely instrumentalized religion, completely instrumentalized it, right? So there are distinct positions here, and Gandhi is carving out, you can see, a very distinct position, different from that of the secular liberal, different from that of somebody like Jinnah, who simply instrumentalizes it, different from the devout person who says the text is infallible. If the text says it, the scripture says it, you can't touch it. Gandhi disagrees with all of these positions and carves out a very distinct niche for himself. Right? So, this is what I mean when I say that Gandhi was in many ways a player of infinite games. Right? And therefore it follows, to come to my last thought, that because he was a player of infinite games, I invite you to join me in thinking of Gandhi that way, and therefore rejecting all these considerations that are usually put forward about Gandhi's relevance, right? Gandhi's usefulness, Gandhi as a peacemaker, and all of that. Gandhi is there to disrupt your thinking, to make you less certain of the ethical positions that you have very conveniently. When I say you, I mean not one person, of course, I mean the generality of us, right? Let us relieve Gandhi of the burden of being a slave. That's the first thing he would have said, and that is one reason why I have never addressed him as Gandhi Ji. Some of you would have noticed that perhaps. Right? Let us take him for what he is and work with the way in which he created a vision of life as infinite play. Thank you.
can say is shoo. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I've been trying to put down some adjectives of this particular presentation. And I'm sure you'll all agree with me that it was encapsulating, it was riveting, thought-provoking, and of course it was controversial. And I think that Professor Lau did warn us. In fact, he told me earlier that he already is almost like persona non grata in India because of the statements that he made. But it's a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I don't know whether there's been any responses on Zoom yet, but I'm going to just open up the discussion now. If somebody has got a comment to make or a question to ask, please do so. Isha?